introduction.
Thanks.
Right, there we go. Peter's done that. Well done, Peter.
Yeah, I just about remembered it. Okay, welcome back, everyone, to the Exeter Psychedelic Research Colloquium, or whatever it's called. So today, I'm honoured and pleased to introduce Dr. David Luke, who I'm especially grateful because he's suffering COVID today. So thanks a lot for being here, David. David is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Greenwich. He's an honorary senior lecturer at Imperial College. He's a lecturer at the Aleph Trust. He's the co-founder of, I think, Europe's largest psychedelic conference, Breaking Convention, which almost happened here in Exeter. Unfortunately, a bit too late, but maybe another time. No, okay, to be discussed. David's research ranges from altered states of consciousness, transpersonal psychology, parapsychology, anomalous phenomena. He's conducted clinical trials with LSD, DMT, etc. He's got hundreds of research papers. He's been called the psychedelic Indiana Jones, even. I think by the Express. And he's a good friend of mine after he gave me about 100 books. So anyway, today's talk is entitled DMT, Indigenous Gateway to the Soul and Endogenous Reality Thermostat. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you very much, Peter and Celia, for hosting me. Am I allowed to use slides? Because
have you got a co-host? Hang on a sec.
I'm disabled.
Cool. I will.
Yeah, I can do that.
Can you make co-host?
Yeah.
I don't know if I forgot. Yeah, cool.
Thank you.
There you go. You can share.
Anyway, I'm absolutely delighted to be here, wherever here is, everywhere, kind of currently. Although I'd much prefer to have actually been in Exeter. Anyway, well, hopefully we'll get to catch up in 3D at some point, or maybe even 4 or 5D, which I'll probably touch on a little bit in this talk as well. If we happen to have some kind of shared DMT experience, all that will be revealed, I think, if I can actually. I'm going to do this in the kind of edit mode, just so I can see what slides are coming next, because you can't really do it in presenter mode. Is that actually working? What am I showing there? Can you see anything?
Yes, see the slide.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all good.
Oh, all right, okay. So yeah, DMT, Indigenous Gateway to the Soul, or Endogenous Reality Thermostat. So the last bit, the Endogenous Reality Thermostat, I'm not going to give too much context about DMT in particular. I'm hoping you're all going to know some amount about it, in that, you know, it's this kind of widely distributed in nature, naturally occurring psychedelic, probably or maybe occurring in all plants, at least in trace quantities, as a secondary compound, messenger compound. It's you know, not entirely kind of ubiquitous to life, but very prevalent and very ancient, thought to exist in all mammals, and in fact pretty much most kingdoms, apart from insects and fungi. And fungi, of course, have their own version. They call it 4-hydroxy as dimethyltryptamine, or psilocin. Of course, I'm talking about NN-dimethyltryptamine here, the classic DMT, or dimethyltryptamine. And yeah, not found in insects, but it might explain why they do happen to appear in people's DMT trips quite so frequently, but we'll come back to that. So yeah, I also just have to kind of get in my caveat and self-apology now, that this might be a bit shonky, in that I kind of cobbled it all together from like a Frankenstein's monster from a few of the talks just before this talk, and I have COVID. That's my excuse for being a little bit shambolic. I don't normally have that excuse, but it's always good to have that backup. So yeah, DMT then is you know, naturally occurring, very simple molecule, possibly one of the most intense psychedelic experiences you could hope to, or it's like one of the most intense experiences you can hope to have, probably on any level, if you happen to have a kind of high dose breakthrough kind of experience, which is usually best done through kind of inhalation or vaporization or smoking, because of course it's not orally active, so you can't really eat DMT. Hence the Amazonian people have made kind of ayahuasca, where they mix DMT with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor to allow it to be ingested into the bloodstream by bypassing the kind of enzymes in the stomach and blood, which will kind of stop its oral activation and therefore allow it to get transported to the brain. But otherwise, you can ingest pure DMT. You can actually snort it, but that's not very popular. It's not very easy to do with kind of extracted kind of versions of DMT, unless you get very pure crystals. And but most popularly then kind of vaporized or smoked. And when you do kind of vaporize or smoke it, if you do it properly with the right technique, you only need one lungful, and you inhale that one big lungful, and by the time you exhale, you've pretty much left the stage. Not permanently usually, although it can feel like you're dying, but it can come on extremely quickly, very potent. So just the whole time it takes to inhale and then exhale, you've gone somewhere else. And various kind of descriptions of what that might be like are, it's a bit like being punched in the back of the head by God. Alan Watts, the famous kind of psychedelic Zen monk and raconteur, who was infamous for telling these endless rambling stories without ever pausing, was kind of challenged by his chums. I think it was Tim Leary and some of the others at the time, and they gave him a pipe full of DMT mid story, because he never shut up. And of course they did actually manage to kind of stop him from talking for a whole 10 minutes, although he did, however, as soon as he kind of returned from his trip, come back and carry on the story as where he left off by all accounts. But he did say that trying to give a running commentary of experience was like being fired out of an atomic cannon with neon Byzantine barreling. So that gives you a bit of a sense of it. And of course it is quite a kind of geometric intense experience. These are the classic Kluverian form constants, or entoptics as they're known, are that Heinrich Kluver kind of identified in the 1920s from his research with mescaline, supposedly 4 different types. So there's a suggested 6, so there's 7. It's a bit like Spinal Tap, isn't it? Someone will come up with 11, I'm sure, pretty much soon, like dimensions. Anyway, so the geometric patterns are quite common, and hence the neon Byzantine barreling on your atomic cannon, and they often can be hyper florid, very kind of super kind of colorful. It's a bit like the kind of corollary with people who have tetrachromatosis, is it, where they have 4 color receptors in their eye. They are able to see something like 10 billion colors, where the rest of us only get to see 1 million colors. And that kind of jump to kind of DMT hyperspace or hyperspaces is a bit like that, in terms of you may see what Kluver also reported as Martian colors, like colors you didn't think you'd ever seen before, or certainly would struggle to imagine. So very geometric, very colorful experiences, and often can be quite synesthetic, much like these Shipibo, Kanebo yarn paintings, which are supposedly depicting these kind of geometric visions induced by DMT within ayahuasca. However, in this case, this is not so much what the experience looks like as to what it sounds like, or rather, this is what sound looks like under the influence of ayahuasca. So this is kind of supposedly a synesthetic interpretation of the Icaro, the ayahuasca song that the shaman sings. So they can often be very multisensory as well, but that's the least of your kind of psychedelic concerns when you have a DMT experience. All the kind of fancy kind of symmetry and synesthesia and geometry and Martian colors is merely window dressing to the absolute astonishment. And you know, in terms of the actual geometric patterns themselves, they can often take on hyperdimensional kind of aspects to them, or at least that's how people perceive them. So very often people report that the geometry itself has more than the usual 3 spatial dimensions that they can ordinarily even imagine or understand. And people often talk about them having, you know, well, you know, in a questionnaire given out by Rick Strassman, he had a question on there, the hallucinogen rating scale, about the dimensionality of the mental imagery that people were having, or the imagery. And, you know, there was a kind of option for 3D, multi-D, or beyond D. And apparently everybody in the high dose condition put either multi-D or beyond D in terms of, you know, how many dimensions their imagery had. So it seems quite common to have that experience, but that's a whole other discussion I'm not going to get into too deeply. And even that in and of itself is, yes, astonishing, but not really the major take-home experience from the DMT encounter. And typically what is the most memorable and colorful element of the DMT experience is encounter with other than self entities, for want of better words. You know, often elves, as Terence McKenna famously said, you know, you get elves, everybody does. Turns out not quite everybody does, although I have to say, yes, I got elves on my very first DMT experience, not really having come across very much in the way of DMT lore, LORE. In fact, I had no idea really what DMT was until I found myself yeah, kind of basically surrounded by small kind of creatures, you know, about yay high, kind of collecting light, I think sunlight perhaps, and just kind of shoving it inside my solar plexus, which seemed to be kind of quite an ecstatic experience. I say shoving it inside my solar plexus, only kind of in the region where my solar plexus appeared or felt to be, because I had no actual concept of my physical body at this point, which is also quite common with DMT. So there's a kind of loss of kind of bodily awareness that comes with it as well. Anyway, I got elves, but not everybody does, and we'll kind of look at kind of how common elves are. Now, you don't even necessarily need DMT to get elves either, for that matter. You know, they do tend to pop up quite a bit in other psychedelic and other drug-like experiences, like delirium experiences. And I'll just give you a kind of quick tangent side story here of when I was in Brazil, having organized a parapsychology research conference there over a decade ago. And myself and a whole bunch of delegates went off to see the Guarani Indians for a tobacco ceremony, supposedly, for a bit of light relief after having gone to 2 ayahuasca ceremonies and a Umbanda transpossession ceremony in the previous 3 nights. We thought we'd have a bit of a kind of quiet night on the Sunday and go to a tobacco ceremony. Little did we know that the Indians had, so-called Indians, had other ideas and decided to spike us all with datura. Curiously, no casualties were made in the creation of this documentary, which was astonishing, despite, you know, people going home and back to their hotels and finding their beds full of corpses and things like that. But one of the most astonishing things is 2 of my ex-students said they saw a little elf-like man, a little man dancing around the fireplace in the Indians' hut that you can see there. And, you know, they asked me, had I seen it? I was like, well, no, what did he look like? And they described him to me. He said, you know, these kind of big almond-shaped eyes, and it was about this high, and he looked about 300 years old, and little winsome face. And I was like, what, you both saw him? And I was like, yes, we both saw him as well, you know, thinking then he must have actually been there. But of course, you know, it was actually just a shared hallucination. But then they said, well, actually, we drew a picture. One of them drew a picture of said little man. There he is. There's my 2 ex-students, and there is said little man with little wizened face and big almond eyes. And the moment they showed me that picture, I suddenly remembered seeing a small 300-year-old looking wizened lady with big almond-shaped eyes and a smile from ear to ear, grinning at me over the top of the seats on the minibus we were supposed to take home from the Indians' hut. So, you know, you could probably classify that under some kind of shared hallucination, whatever that might be, which kind of in and of itself throws up some interesting ontological questions, which I'll come back to. So, you know, elves are pretty common, so they say, but not just with DMT. Perhaps some of the more bamboozling types of entity encounters are things like encounters with ginormous praying mantis, insectoid-like aliens, you know, according to people's reports. And it's not just their appearance, it's often their behavior as well, which seems to have this kind of trope or mimetic quality to it of not just are you encountering some giant, you know, 25-foot tall praying mantis, that they tend to be leaning over you doing some kind of weird brain operation, inserting stuff, taking stuff out, retuning you, usually considered to have no emotions of themselves and often considered to be farming you for your own emotions, perhaps on board some kind of alien spaceship or something like that. That seems to be, you know, I'm not saying relatively common, but it does pop up a lot. I mean, it pops up more often than it probably should, is the point. In fact, you know, that would seem to be such a kind of unique kind of descriptor of an experience and encounter type and behavior that we would pray, no pun intended, that it doesn't pop up too often, because we, you know, how do we explain it otherwise? But it, you know, it is relatively common, and we'll try and find some prevalence on that pretty soon. Kind of experience. So my good friend David J. Brown posted this up recently. He's actually in the process of creating a bestiary of DMT entities, which I'd like to turn into a pack of top trumps cards, which I think we could make some good cashish on. If anybody's interested, you can put in your pre-orders now, or maybe I'll crowdfund it. Anyway, so we put up this post. Wow, first drawing is by David Huggins. So he's put up a picture by somebody else of from an alien abductee group, of an apparent alien abduction experience that somebody's kind of had drawn or drawn themselves, and he compared that to his own DMT experience. This is, which I asked him about, was in the mid-90s. And, you know, on one side you've got an alien doing some weird kind of brain operations, and on the other side you've got a DMT entity, in this case a ginormous praying mantis, doing some weird kind of brain operations. And this is, you know, I've heard this story a lot from people naively as well, people who didn't know anything much about DMT or psychedelics, perhaps often having their first ayahuasca or DMT experience and having these very similar kind of encounter experiences with praying mantises. Unfortunately, this is in the realm largely of anecdote. And here's a nice picture from MC Escher, who's kind of, yeah. Well, what was going on there? I mean, maybe just some kind of prescience, or perhaps he kind of fueled the memes for later alien abduction experiences. But it's interesting here, we've got, this is called Dream something religious. I can't remember what the actual name of the image is. But it's interesting here and curious how the supine figure with the praying mantis over them is both a religious figure, so it's kind of perhaps a spiritual experience. They look like they could be either dead or asleep in some kind of, you know, dream or kind of near death-like or death-like experience, which kind of sums up the DMT encounter beautifully. And Escher, of course, was the master of squeezing in too many dimensions or kind of paradoxes into his artwork. So, you know, if Escher wasn't pre-guessing DMT experiences, I don't know who was. Anyway, let's try and look at some of the prevalence rates we have. And, you know, up until very recently, research in this area was pretty much curtailed to really obscure and underground journals like the Entheogen Review, Journal of Unauthorized Research on Psychedelics, you know, and you were very unlikely to get any of this kind of stuff into anything like a mainstream academic journal. That's changed, of course, in the last couple of years. So in 2020, there was a massive survey of entity encounters with DMT in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, which is, you know, not a joke journal. published, of course, by the fantastic team at Johns Hopkins, Alan Davis, first author, Roland Griffiths, and of over 2,500 people responding to their survey had been filtered, and these were people who had DMT entity encounters. You can see some of the prevalences of these classic kind of encounters. So now this isn't, the way they've done this is a bit awkward in that, you know, people were given a discrete list of possible descriptors. So there wasn't an insectoid or praying mantis option, unfortunately, in this particular list, and they could select as many as they liked, which applied. But those who did, you know, 39% said their encounter experiences were alien, you know, described them as being somewhat alien. And the little people category is a bit hard to discern because they use 3 different types of little people: elves, fairies and gnomes. But so anywhere between 14 and 27% of people get elves. There you go, that's the answer we were looking for if we want to be a bit pedantic about Terence McKenna's kind of like loose tongue. You know, not everybody gets elves, Terence, only 14 to 27%. So there you go. Let's have a bit of accuracy about this. So more recently, however, there's and I'm just going to throw up some comparison data as well. This is from a paper which is just being accepted in scientific reports. This is from the preprint scientific reports, of course, no joke journal either. And they had slightly less. They did a kind of a content analysis of 3,500 Reddit posts about people's experiences on the DMT thread on Reddit, of which 16% were classified as being aliens. About 7% in all categories were little people, so elves, so even less people getting elves. A lot of the clowns, similarly, figures of 6% of clowns and jesters, another one of those kind of classic DMT trope entities. And they actually had some figures on insectoids of about 2.3%. Now, how common should insectoid alien praying mantises with no emotions farming you for yours and doing stuff to your brain, how common should those kind of experiences be? Well, it's a bit hard to say. But if, you know, to give it some perspective, every time you say 1 in 25 times you pop to the bathroom, that happened to you, you know, you'd probably think it probably happens too much. So, you know, what is 2.3% of encounter experiences being insectoids? How can we kind of put that into any kind of like probabilistic sense? Well, it's a bit hard to, but it does seem like a lot. And then I'm just going to report on my own data as well. The thing is about these surveys, they are obviously problematic in many respects because, you know, they're self-selecting in many ways. People either kind of choose to take part in the survey, or on Reddit they choose to kind of post their stuff up online, and so that they probably skewed into some kind of direction. Whereas we actually took a kind of discrete data set, and we actually went around to people's houses when they were smoking DMT and then interviewed them. And we had a sample of 39 people in this case, or 39 experiences of people, and tried to get some kind of corollary kind of, you know, to kind of comparison prevalence figures to back this up. And these figures are in some cases somewhat lower and in some cases higher. So about 6% of those encounters could be considered to be alien by the people's own kind of language. Only 3%, the elves are fast departing the more we try and pin them down, which is a curious thing. So the elves were present, but not very common. Actually, quite a few more jesters, clown encounter experiences. And I have to say also, this is a much smaller sample. So this is, okay, so we can't say it's representative, but it is discrete. So it's kind of, it's free perhaps of a lot of those biases of the other samples, but it's also kind of not is easily generalizable because of its size. And something like 14% insectoid encounters, including a praying mantis. And also one of my favorites is the good old octopoids, which are actually seemingly quite common. And that is another one of these kind of DMT entity trope mean encounter experiences. one which I actually started myself in about 2008 when I published this paper called Disembodied Eyes Revisited about one of my last DMT entity encounter experience with something that actually scared the total life out of me. I can't even say it. It teared the strife out of me as well. I don't know what that is. And that was something akin to a swarming, writhing mass of geometric serpents with smiling eyeball hypnosis, something like that. I guess the best way to describe it, but a kind of Fibonacci ensemble of separate serpenty tentacles all forming one body in a kind of Fibonacci like spiral gyrating motion with their eyes looking at you in a really intimidating way. It turns out I'm not the only person who's had this encounter experience, and I did a lot of digging around and found lots of other, some accidentally and some by design, other people having similar experiences, particularly with DMT, but also with other psychedelics, and also finding a type of mythological archetype which fits some of the descriptors of this encounter, of this being some kind of guardian blocking the way, terrifying people, intimidating them, and basically saying, what the hell are you doing here? You're not allowed here. And lucky enough, in our DMT field experiment, one of the first few participants in our study also seemingly naively, I don't think, as far as we could tell, he hadn't come across my obscure paper in the Journal of Unauthorized Psychedelic Research. He had one of these encounter experiences himself, right at the beginning of his DMT, as he kind of broke through the veil. He had what he described as this kind of huge oval of eyes that were very scary, and he believed he had died. And that's like one of the other kind of tropes that goes along with this particular encounter experience, is in many of the mythological encounters with this thing with the multitudinous eyes is often considered to be a guardian of the underworld or the angel of death. So, you know, there's a trope there with this kind of encounter experience. One which you can see obviously plastered over the front of Rick Strassman's book, which came out about the same time as my experience, coincidentally, and DMT, the spirit molecule, in which he kind of hypothesizes that DMT experiences, or at least near-death experiences, can be explained by the spontaneous release of endogenous DMT, and what he called a kind of DMT is a kind of reality thermostat. And when, you know, it kind of like a burst of it tips you over the edge, your reality also goes to the top of the thermostatic dial. And he also said it could account for alien abduction experiences and perhaps even sleep paralysis experiences and so on and so forth. Now, the problem with this is, of course, it's quite convenient on the one hand that you have this extremely potent endogenous psychedelic which gives you these kind of encounter experiences, but using it to explain all other spontaneous encounter-like experiences such as sleep paralysis, alien abduction, cosmic consciousness, near-death experiences, and so on, is you know, it kind of loses its explanatory value if it explains everything. Now, it might be a part of some of those processes, and if you compare the phenomenologies, there is some degree of overlap, but to say it explains all of these is probably kind of oversimplifying things, let's say. I'm not going to dwell on that either too much, because Peter had a special request, and I want to get to that. And that's to talk about the epistemology. I'm going to touch on briefly on the ontology still. Where am I? Oh yeah, so these encounter experiences are also very, very common. Rick Strassman got something like 50% of his high dose experiences had like these breakthrough experience, had an encounter with a high dose. Whether or not, I think probably higher than that. It depends on your sample, maybe. Chris Timmerman and his team at Imperial, they got 75% entity encounters in their preliminary study. You'll notice they're including things with tentacles and eyes, seems to be very popular. even when you've only got 12 participants. And we actually in our study got something like 95% entity encounters, but we were using highly screened DMT adepts, these kind of like well-experienced DMT psychonauts only taking high doses, as opposed to Chris's study where they had a kind of dose escalation. So, you could be getting kind of total saturation if you select your psychonauts and make sure they're having breakthrough doses. We could almost guarantee entity encounters, okay, at a certain threshold. So there's various ontological positions, which I'm just going to touch upon briefly, and that is, of course, you have the kind of classic constructivist neurotheological reductionist materialist reductionist perspective that it's just kind of chemical misfiring or aberrant chemical firing in the brain, and that gives rise to this special experience, and that these kind of the universal features of these entities are somehow and somewhere hardwired into the brain. And of course, they are triggered by the neurochemicals and DMT in this particular case, which is all well and good to a point, except for it's also a convenient kind of armchair retroactive explanation in many respects. Like, oh yeah, we can account for these encounter experiences because it's just tweaking your kind of sentient other sense presence kind of nodules. And actually, in a debate I had with Robin Carhart-Harris at Imperial, he suggested that because DMT you have this kind of intense visual experience, you have this kind of a kind of pareidolia whereby the kind of noise in the visual mental imagery of the geometric patterns takes on a kind of face-like proportions. In that, we have this kind of tendency to see faces and everything, which is true. It's kind of hardwired into our kind of mental architecture, which is all well and good. And so as you see these kind of, you start to see faces, and therefore you apply sentience to those faces, right? Because of this kind of apophenic, pareidelic kind of like finding a signal in the visual noise, which is all well and good, except for on our DMT field study, we had DMT experience taking part who were aphantasic, and that is they have no visual mental imagery whatsoever. It doesn't even register on behavioral tests. They're not faking it either. They genuinely don't have any visual mental imagery. And yet when they take DMT, they get entities, and they have, they full-blown DMT mystical entity encounter with kind of alien elements to it, or even elven-like kind of twang to it, and yet they don't actually see anything. And also, this kind of classic neurotheological position struggles to account for how you get very specific encounters with, say, things like giant praying mantis aliens doing strange operations on your brain and farming you for your emotions. What part of the brain is hardwired for those kinds of experiences, and why? So it begs a lot more questions than it necessarily immediately answers. And of course, then we have to kind of bring in, which is important, the contextualist argument, which is that there is no such thing as a pure culturally unmediated experience. All our experience of the world is not kind of coming directly from the external world itself. It's contextualized by our previous past experience, right? So that any kind of cultural influences you had, or memes you've absorbed, or Terence McKenna quotes you've heard, are likely to color the kind of experience you're going to have and kind of give it a particular hue. So it becomes a natural impossibility in teasing apart a person's prior cultural influences from what are perhaps the core kind of fundamental components of the DMT experience itself, beyond cultural experience. And of course, it's kind of a nonsense to try and separate those two out. There were some, supposed urban mythical experiments done in this department, such as supposedly there was a story going around that somebody in the 1960s had taken ayahuasca and given it to Inuits or Eskimos in the kind of northern wastes of the North Americas. And of course, the classic ayahuasca experience is encountering serpents and jaguars, and of course, our erstwhile Inuits encountered jaguars and serpents, even though they have no jaguars or serpents up there in the Arctic tundra. That would have been a brilliant experiment, because, you know, you could almost guarantee that in the 1960s they'd had no mimetic influences about what they should expect to encounter with ayahuasca, and yet that brilliant experiment never happened. It was a kind of urban myth that was traced back to Berkeley University campus. But that is the kind of experiment which would have been brilliant in the pre-internet age, but is almost now, even now, it would be, you couldn't guarantee, well, you couldn't even vaguely guarantee that, you know, there hadn't, you know, an Inuit hadn't come across Terence McKenna or the ideas about, you know, DMT entities. So we can't get away from this contextualist kind of problem either. And other positions are, you know, this essentialist, perennialist position that maybe there are access to some kind of universal higher reality or freestanding kind of other world, that some kind of universal higher truth or something like that. Now, whether or not the entities necessarily exist or not, and then of course then we need to kind of consider some of the kind of psychological interpretations that we actually have encounters with our own kind of you know, unconscious psychological processes. And then of course we have the literalist position, which is actually quite popular, and that is we genuinely are encountering those things that we seem to be encountering at face value, right? And that's a popular position because so many people report that these experiences are more real than real. I'll come back to that in a second. I see I'm running out of time rapidly, but I'm going to kind of try and wrap this up really fast. So, you know, trying to go back to a kind of the first DMT experiences would be one way to kind of circumvent this contextualist argument. And so myself and Andrew Gallimore attempted to do that. We tried to look at some of the very first uses of DMT, of pure DMT, when it was kind of first synthesized, not first synthesized, but when first used with humans, which was by Stephen Sara in the 1950s in Hungary. And we managed to track down Stephen Sara and interview him. Unfortunately, those original papers and all his original documents all got lost in the hospital, I think in a fire or something like that. So we were just kind of working on his memory and the few little sketches of kind of reports that were kind of scattered through those papers, although they weren't paying very much attention to the phenomenology or the contents of the experiences, unfortunately. Stephen Sara actually died last year, aged 98, nearly kind of beating Albert Hoffman. You know, on one of those first experiences, he basically injected all his psychiatric colleagues and some patients with DMT, and of course they had entity encounters. Classically, some even reported encounters with like little gnomes like people. So, you know, the elves or the little people were there right from the get-go in the 1950s when DMT, pure DMT is first used with humans. And of course, encounters with kind of deities was quite common. And I love this quote. The whistling has stopped. I have arrived. In front of me are two quiet, sunlit gods. They gaze at me and nod in a friendly manner. I think they are welcoming me into this new world. Thank you, Stephen. Anyway, so yeah. In a more recent paper from Rowan Griffiths and the Hopkins team, which literally came out last week, so it's hot off the press, and so if I'm not kind of presenting this in the best way, I literally just bunged this in 10 minutes before I started. They looked at kind of how entity encounter, which is this? Oh, these are the entity encounter experiences. I've got backpedaling. This is how real people thought these experiences were. More real than real was, you know, 81% of people thought the experience was more real than waking reality. People believed the kind of most often believed it was a kind of in some real but different dimension to this reality, and that 96% of people thought the entities they encountered were conscious, self-aware, and intelligent. 96%. So on the whole, people generally believe these things were, self-existent. Even that they had agency in this world. The majority of people thought they had agency in this world, 54%, although kind of weirdly only 23% thought they were petitionable, which is a bit of a worry, because if they do have agency but they're not petitionable, then you got to be careful not to piss them off. So people have these experiences, on the whole tend to feel that they've really encountered something, so much so that more than half of all atheists who before the experience, when they came back after the experience, were no longer atheists. That's an astonishing figure. I mean, you can't even get your head around that little factoid, which came from this paper a couple of years ago. So 1 10-minute psychedelic experience has the potential of converting more than half of all atheists into non-atheists in the space of 10 minutes. Just let us sink in there for a second. I know I've probably run out of time, but Peter asked me to talk about epistemology. I've really only talked about ontology. So if you kind of grace me with 5 to 10 more minutes. This is the paper that just came out this week, which I was stupidly misalluding to. And that is that they looked at the degree to which people ascribed consciousness to other than human entities, like not DMT entities necessarily, following psychedelic experiences. So the degree to which people kind of increase their animistic or panpsychistic beliefs to some extent. Peter may correct me on my terminology a bit here, but you'll find that generally there was a kind of big increase in people's how much consciousness they ascribed to other than human things, some of which were also organic, not all. So even inanimate objects were kind of tended to have ascribed more consciousness following psychedelic experiences. So basically, psychedelics have a tendency to turn people in an animist. Are you interrupting me, Peter?
No, all good. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I'm just going to wrap it up then in the next 5 minutes. Just to give you some statistics on this. So yeah, people went from 21% of them believing that fungi might be conscious to 56% of them thinking that fungi was probably conscious after their psychedelic experiences. And all of these kind of beliefs kind of increased the further away in time they got from the experience as well, curiously. And in fact, I think even like something like the I remember reading the paper, the general population believes that about 6% of the population believe that plants might be conscious, whereas people who've taken psychedelics, that shoots up to about 64%. So, like a tenfold increase on the general population in terms of how conscious they believe plants to be. And as I pointed out when I reviewed that paper, it's probably due to the fact that people partly have encounter experiences often with the substances they're ingesting, but also other kinds of encounter experiences with other kind of nature-like entities. And I did this research with a view to kind of trying to better understand how psychedelics make people more ecologically orientated, which they do, increase their nature relatedness. And so we looked at 6 different transpersonal type encounters or transpersonal type visionary experiences, psychedelic experiences. The first 4 of which were kind of encounter experiences, either with mythic beings, hybrid, half animal, half human beings, plant intelligences, plant or fungi intelligences, and animal spirits or communications and so on. The last 2 were transformations into other species, and the final one were visions of a nature variety. We're just going to focus on the transformations because these are the most exciting ones for me. There's the data. I'm just going to kind of drill down into that a bit. So for instance, with ayahuasca, 37% of people taking ayahuasca felt like they'd had an encounter with the spirit or intelligence of the ayahuasca itself. Not quite clear whether they mean ayahuasca vine or chacruna or ayahuasca brew, but with ayahuasca. And 27%, so about a quarter of people, had an experience of being transformed into another species, right? And this isn't necessarily what people expect when they go on, ayahuasca tourism holidays to Peru to deal with their depression or increase their kind of problem-solving creativity around their new app they're developing. But they suddenly get turned into another species. but it's quite a common experience, and not just with ayahuasca either, but also DMT. We had about 10%, and also with LSD, good old LSD. Even that had the capacity of turning people into other species. So it's not just a kind of, oh, that's what Amerindian shamanism is all about. It's something that comes from these psychedelic experiences to some extent inherently as well. And it is what Amerindian shamanism is all about. I'll give you a couple of quotes here. First one's from Eduardo Vivero de Castro. In mythical times, animals, plants, and humans were all persons able to transform. They were all shamans. You find this idea in old narratives. In the beginning, everyone was a person. The original condition common to humans and animals is not animality, but rather humanity. Shamans are able to see non-human beings as they see themselves as human, those playing the role of acting interlocutors in specific dialogue. So Eduardo Vivero de Castro is talking about Amerindian shamanism here as an anthropologist of that field. And to kind of continue with this line of thinking with Luis Eduardo Luna, another Amerindian anthropologist, he said, in Western science, it's all about being objective, taking away the subject so you have full objectivity. Amerindian shamanism seems to be guided by the reverse principle, the opposite idea. To know is to personify, to take the point of view of that which is to be known, or rather, who, for shamanic knowledge, envisages something which is someone, another subject or agent. The other takes the form of a person. So I think one of the basic ideas of shamanism is that in order to learn something, you become that you want to learn from. So knowledge is becoming, transforming into. And so we not only see this in Amerindian psychedelic shamanism and even in Amerindian cosmology, generally speaking, but we see it emerging in the phenomenology of experiences of kind of non-Amerindians, of Westerners, of kind of, so-called developed world, civilized nation, Northern Hemisphere, communal gardens, psychonauts, having these experiences of transforming into other species. And I'm going to give you one really good example of this, which was we ran a clinical trial with LSD, about 6 years ago now. It's only just been published a few weeks ago, the first papers in that. And we were lucky enough to have like top level PhD scientists from various prestigious institutions, unfortunately not Greenwich and Exeter, who were all, PhDs in physics, biology, maths, material science, so on and so forth. One of those characters, fortunately, has de-embargoed himself from this study and de-anonymized himself, and that is Merlin Sheldrake, who recently published this brilliant best-selling book. It's been at the top of the best-selling charts since it came out over a year ago, called Entangled Life, all about fungi. And in the first part of the book, he talks about how he took part in this clinical trial with LSD with a view to creatively problem solving his PhD thesis conundrum, which was he was working on the relationship between a plant and a fungus, which he'd been studying in the Panama jungle. And this particular plant grows directly out of the fungus and doesn't photosynthesize. It's like a ghost plant. And it's always considered that the plant is directly taking all of its energy from the fungus in a parasitic-like way. Now, Merlin wasn't so sure. He kind of spent 3 years doing his PhD, collecting all his data, researching the life out of this, and he still didn't really know the nature of this relationship. He took LSD and, he had his experience, and we interviewed him afterwards, as we did with all the scientists, hoping they're going to have some kind of breakthrough. And he said he turned into the fungus and he was able to grow inside the rootstock of this ghost plant and find out what it was like. And we were like, great. And what was it like? And he said, slimy. And we were like, oh my God, I hope that's useful. It turns out it was useful because, you'll have to read the book. I don't want to read it for you, but, it kind of underpins a lot of his message of, he basically had this shift in perspectivism, right? That whereby he was able to see the problem, not from a human-centric viewpoint, but from the viewpoint of the fungus. And it gave him a whole new take on the nature of his PhD problem. And so what we have here is this kind of stepping over the fold from our, what we're supposed to only do as scientists is be objective, is try and kind of distance ourselves as far away as we can from our subject matter, which in the case of humans is impossible, of course, and anything else for that matter. You know, objectivity is really just a subjective illusion, or at best a kind of collective intersubjectivity. And whereas in Amerindian epistemology, the idea is that you be as subjective as possible. You try and merge with that very thing. You become that thing, becoming a knowing by becoming. So I wanted to throw that out there. And I'm really delighted to say that after some discussions with a PhD, prospective PhD student, she is now going to study her PhD at the University of Ottawa on this thesis title, Knowing by Becoming, a Phenomenology of Entheogen-Induced Interspecies Transformation, just to kind of study this very thing. So I didn't get a chance to tell you about our amazing book, but that was the first book that we did, which came out. And I didn't get a chance to tell you about the experimental research, which we did based off the back of that as the Interdimensional Embassy, where we tried to test some of these ontological conundrums, but maybe I can throw that out in Q&A. Otherwise, or just I should say about the more recent book we've done, and I'll leave it there for now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, David. That was both very informative and entertaining. So excellent fusion. Really just laughing constantly, but learning a lot at the same time. Thank you very much. Right, well, questions.
Is it on? That microphone's not on. Can you hear all right? Yeah. Can you hear from the room? Or?
Yes.
If you would see them now.
We can
Yeah, I
hear
don't know
you.
how good. We're trying to switch it around so you can see from 7.5 questions.
How about this?
There might be one from the
Oh, that's
chat
good.
as well.
Look, there we go.
Now,
I've got it.
now it's all over there, and there's nothing happening. In
There's
the
nothing, but
front
that's
room.
good because then we're like looking at the camera because it's the back camera. Yeah, that's good. I think that's good.
I think someone's written in the chat. I don't know if it's a question or a comment.
And there's a question. I don't know if you can see.
Oh, something appeared on the screen and it disappeared.
Know how to flip the camera? Sorry, David. That's really ruining.
Press all buttons.
Yeah. It's all the tech. Oh yeah, maybe buttons are a good idea. Oh, front wall. There we go.
Ooh.
Nice dream there. Front wall. Like that. That's too much. Like that. Whoa, look at that. We're going by audience. There we go. Audience. Okay. No. Audience. No, it's audience.
The camera's zooming in on its own, isn't it? They have a life of their own, some of those cameras.
Its own sentience.
Trying to operate.
Yeah.
My dream there. Yeah, that doesn't work. Oh, it's just doing it itself. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll just leave it. Anyway, you can't see anyone, but maybe you had a question over there, sorry. Can you hear David?
Yeah.
And
Can you hear me? All right. Thanks so much, David. Good to see you. If you can't see me, it's Mark.
Yeah.
So I have a question about when you break down the ontology, the possibilities for understanding the ontology of entity encounters. You break it down, you delimit and categorize the options as constructivist, contextualist, essentialist, and literalist. And I'm wondering about the extent to which these are mutually exclusive. So presumably, in order to have a literalist account of entities, you have to have mental structures in order to receive the perception of those entities, for example. I can understand that you could have an entirely constructivist viewpoint to the exclusion of the others, but I could also envisage a possibility where all of these explanations are true, without wanting to sound too woolly. I don't see them as mutually exclusive. So my first question is, do you agree with that? And the second question, kind of related to that, is you mentioned, wouldn't it be great if we could give ayahuasca to Inuits and see if they see jaguars, regardless of cultural conditioning. I often saw the fact that Hoffman, in his first LSD experience, saw his doctor as an Aztec priest, as some kind of, because LSA, lysergamides were taken by the Aztecs, as we know. Was that some kind of like, I don't know, morphic resonant or non-culturally transferred psychedelic phenomenon? But then I realized that he was actually well steeped in mescaline literature and in occult, German and other occult literatures. So perhaps that's why that he knew the Aztecs took psychedelics, and that so yeah. What do you think about those two?
Yeah, great. Just the last one first then. Yeah, so Hoffman, when he took psilocybin for the first time, having literally just kind of extracted it from the psilocybin mexicana, and he had this experience of seeing the medical doctor he had on hand coming at him as a kind of Aztec priest, you know, resplendent with feathered headdress, and instead of holding a stethoscope, possibly proffering an obsidian knife coming to cut out his beating heart. And of course himself was aware of, you know, the Mexican provenance of these mushrooms. Psilocybin mexicana, it's a bit of a giveaway, and you know, been given to him, sent to him by Wasson, and he probably would have also been aware of course, the use of psychedelics in Mexico by the Aztecs because of his studies of Ololuki and all the rest of it. So all of that, you know, of course, he was kind of pre-primed to have perhaps that kind of experience. It still surprised him, you know, but what surprised him even more, which he kind of confessed at a later date in a parapsychology conference, was that when he gave the psilocybin to naive participants who didn't know the provenance of it, i.e. that it came from Mexico, that they would often have visions of Aztec temples, Aztec artwork, or Mayan artwork and temples themselves. And he actually suggested that it was some kind of psychometry, that they were kind of accessing the consciousness of the original users of this chemical, right, in a kind of morphic kind of field kind of way, I suppose. And he actually had a bit of a discussion with Wasson over it, and Wasson himself suggested, Gordon Wasson that is, not Valentina, suggested that it was a kind of like a chicken and the egg kind of thing. He was saying, well, you know, it was probably the mushrooms which inspired their artwork and building of temples, which is not the kind of best use of Occam's razor in my book, but you know, obviously you have to kind of throw that into the pot as well. And as for the mutual exclusion of these categories, they're kind of somewhat arbitrary anyway. They're not even comprehensive. I think there are many other kind of ontological positions we could take, and I'm sure Peter could give us a long list. But these are kind of some of the kind of main arguments to kind of throw into the pot, and there is of course overlap. The contextualist one is kind of the one is really hard to get away from a practical position. And of course, you know, I think there must be elements of all of them. You know, you need an explanation which can somehow hold all of those. Perhaps not the literalist one, but we do also need to take into account the fact that the majority of people assume that experience to be more real than this real, right? In which case, how can we trust anybody else's position that this reality is in fact more real, right? When the majority of people have had that experience, say, well, actually that reality is more real. So we can't really just kind of discredit that position either, just based on majority appeal, right? We're in the minority to say that the literalist interpretation is somehow fallacious. So yeah, but I think there's a lot of overlap between them all. Thanks for that, Mark.
Thank you.
Ernesto, that's a good question.
Yeah, I was
Do you
thinking.
want to come up here, Ernesto? Because then you can.
Then you can see me.
Yeah, it's nice to see Ernesto.
Yes, I chose that one because it was easier to see you, but yeah,
No, you
no,
can't, no, you can't.
no, that's a bad idea.
Oh, you messed with the cameras.
Yes, hi, thanks a lot for that. So I was thinking what would be the necessary steps to kind of account for the experiment as being successful. Let's imagine you put ayahuasca, right, without the Inuits having any contact with whatsoever with anyone else. And they actually see jaguars, right? And they can see like Shannon, Antipodes of the Mind, right? That book that you have the same vision all the time. What would it take for that to become evidence? So I mean, this comes from someone that is kind of in the anthropology of science. I think within science, becoming some sort of fact is not a straightforward issue. So I can imagine how much this could be like repeated maybe 10 times. What would be the threshold for this to become evidence that there's something that is some sort of like isomorphic, has the same shape regardless of your cultural context?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's impossible to get past the cultural context, but I mean, I guess the first step, and that's what we're starting to see now, is people are just starting to map the phenomenology of these experiences and see, you know, what's the prevalence of these particular kind of encounters and landscapes and all the rest, as Benny Shannon kind of pioneered, of course, with ayahuasca, with his Antipodes of the Mind, you know, 20 years ago or so. And so we're starting to see that now with DMT in a kind of concerted way. And that's the first step. Is first of all, it's kind of like, what's, you know, the taxonomy, the flora, the fauna, the fungi of these other worlds. And so then what are the commonalities? And, you know, then we can, but even in and of itself, that isn't necessarily evidential. It's evidential of the fact that we probably deserve to study this a little bit further. And say, well, you know, why is it that we have this preponderance towards encountering praying mantis aliens, for instance, right? But then at some point, if we want to turn that kind of the taxonomy or whatever it is into some kind of any kind of evidence, we've got to move into the kind of empirical experimental realm, I think, and that's where we've been trying to take this, obviously not without problems, and that is by like trying to explore shared experiences and other kind of apparent like psychic phenomena. So for instance, one of the common things that people report is with ayahuasca is having a shared experience. Is that, you know, themselves and somebody else in the ceremony were in the same kind of psychic space or having the same kind of experience without apparently communicating that to each other or necessarily priming each other for that experience, right? And so we can begin to try and test that empirically, which is what we've started to do with our DMT field study. Initially, we did some experiments with precognition, and I can show you some data on that. And then we did experiments where people 2 at a time would smoke ayahuasca, you know, together without communicating anything to each other beforehand. And then as soon as they'd finished, we'd separate them off and interview them about their experiences, get them to draw a sketch of the most prominent feature. And then we now have this kind of database of experiences whereby we can get independent judges to look at those and rate them and say, okay, you've got this one experience, and out of these 2 other experiences, which one is it most like? And we can repeat that process over and over again. So we have all the iterations done, and we can compare experiences of 2 people at the same time smoking ayahuasca with the intention of having a shared experience relative to 2 people who are not in any way connected in time or space or intention in having that kind of experience. We haven't yet done that because it's quite complicated how we do that, and need to do some software and need a huge participant pool of people to do the independent judging. And I've also been too busy, but I am going to do it. But you know, initial inspection of these transcripts and images, which I'd love to show you, but I can't right now, are quite astonishing. You know, it seemed to work on the surface of it, you know, at kind of just a purely subjective level, better than you would imagine, right? You know, I didn't think we'd pick up any signal. It was just worth a go. And actually, we've got something interesting there. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily isn't bomb-proof evidence either, but it is again another step in going, well, it's probably worth pursuing this a bit further if we can even get a signal under these relatively uncontrolled conditions, you know, of there being some kind of shared experience or the possibility of there being some self-existent reality to these experiences. So yeah, that's where we're going with it so far.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Helen.
Sorry.
Yeah, do you want to set this, Helen?
Hello. So we were talking about people kind of either being naive to it or having experienced before, but thinking about your people who use this a lot, do any of them go in with the intention of trying to meet these entities again? And how successful are they if they want to go back and talk to them and ask them another question?
Yeah, I mean,
if I saw an entity, I'd want to go back and say hi. Maybe.
What the entity was. I mean, they're usually considered benign, but occasionally they can be a bit scary.
Yeah.
Those ones are best avoided. But right, so I mean, I don't have any kind of like good data on that other than kind of anecdote. And I think, generally speaking, I don't really know if people often intentionally doing this, but occasionally it happens spontaneously where people go back and they have, you know, it kind of like in a kind of like a lucid dream or something like that, you know, where it has this kind of continuity where you go out, you go back in. Shane Mouse gives the really best account of this. He had, have you listened to this, his DMT experience? I can't remember exactly how it goes, but he would have this encounter with this kind of being, and he went back in and he had another encounter with this being, and then it kind of really blew his mind. And not only that, then like some while later, I can't remember exactly, you have to listen to his talk, a friend of his took DMT, or he gave DMT to his friend, and his friend goes in there and comes out going, holy shit, there's this kind of creature in there and it's asking to talk to you. And describes the being that he's been encountering, right? I mean, so that's kind of next level weird. But you know, he is a comedian, so yeah. So actually, people intentionally re-encountering these experiences, I don't know so much of, other than that's what shamans theoretically do, right? And these are kind of often left out of these kind of conversations, other than by anthropologists, but anthropologists aren't really exploring these kind of ontological questions.
I had another issue with this distinction between ontology and epistemology, but I think that's a snobbish one that just comes from this very particular form of anthropology. But I mean, if we take seriously Amerindian approaches, that very Western distinction about ontology as being this kind of real thing and epistemology being knowledge about the reality doesn't hold so well, right? Right. That very distinction is difficult to make. And the question about evidence was because I've been thinking, what would it take for kind of Western experiments to really capture that reality, right? Would I need to add MRI scans to it, right? To make it like kind of hold it to some sort of indicator, right? But I can always dismiss, let's say you do it 10,000 times, and then I add some machine learning, some fancy stuff to add iterations. It's still the quantitative paradigm that you are privileging here.
Yeah.
Right? So you would not accept me going, which actually we do in anthropology, to speak with shamans and bring 100 interviews of that. That's already culturally tainted. It only can happen within the settings of control kind of groups, right? So that was my next sort of question, because actually shamans do that. They become the jaguar. There are lots of great ethnographies about how the other shaman found each other in the jungle, spiritual jungle, meaning as jaguars. But I don't think you would take that as good evidence, right? You would need to test that inside.
Well, someone is doing the study with them, right? It's kind of like
Yes.
using decoding to look at.
There's a new form of like psychedelic phenomenological research that's naturalistic observation, right? I think that's like what's her name? Malin? Can't remember her surname. Utag, yeah. So she like actually accepts that you can't control all the variables. So it was just a bit more anthropological. She goes into the actual context itself and accepts that you can't control all the variables and that there are going to be cultural elements, but still looks at it from as much as you can a scientific viewpoint. I think that's
in different cultural contexts.
Yeah. In that, so she's. I think she says you can't really isolate ayahuasca. You can't really isolate ayahuasca. You can't drink ayahuasca in a lab. Well, you can, But like in order to scientifically understand it, you have to actually incorporate the cultural surround, even though she's looking at it from a more a more like psychological.
Exactly what an ethnographer would do.
Yes, yeah, but I think she's looking more like individuals than like social forces or social theory.
I mean, some anthropologists want to be more scientific and they want to quantify interactions.
Right, yeah.
Right. Some people were obsessed with that and they created a database of 65 million dreams to find differences between cultures. And I can imagine you can go all the way with this.
Yeah.
Dream maps, very cool. I mean, to go back to your points then, I mean, yes, actually you can kind of take it to the kind of quantitative angle. I mean, obviously there's a bit of a kind of like neuro-fetishism inherent in this, and it's like, what's wrong with just a bit of kind of good old statistics? We need to have some neuroimaging to kind of really kind of make it convincing, but we can do that.
I like that.
The proposals is to use kind of like high level brain scanning, particularly on the occipital region, you know, based on the idea that in these recent studies, they're able to show that you can get machine learning to predict what somebody's looking at based on their occipital lobe activity, right? And also another study which showed that ayahuasca activity in occipital lobe seems to mimic, with closed eyes, seems to mimic open eye activity. So it's like there is a kind of this similarity between what a person normally sees and what a person sees internally when they're on ayahuasca. And so on this principle, we were hoping to, and I don't know if this is going to happen, this is down to Imperial.
Isn't it at UCL? I think Rafi's doing that study. Sorry.
Well, I'd like to have that discussion, but like to do like, but not just to look at how similarity, not just like what's going on in the person's occipital lobe and on DMT, but have people two at a time, you know, going into that experiment. And you can then actually get a kind of machine learned kind of version of their visual experience or visionary experience, right? Which if you've got two people at the same time, you can actually compare them and see if they're having this kind of shared experience from a more objective position. And you can even have a sham condition. You can have people with like a kind of divider and root in a kind of like separate room in brain imaging devices next to each other, having DMT at the same time, and they don't know whether the other person's in the other room or not, whether they're having a shared experience with somebody else or they're just having an experience on their own. And we could completely objectively look at this whole notion of shared visionary experiences.
But who's to say that looking at like a brain scan is more objective than language itself? Because I mean, that's looking at, I mean, it's still like an interpretation on, it's still like a statistical set, like a map, not the territory, right?
Yeah, I agree, but it's to kind of add to the evidence. I mean, I think we're
right, yeah, it's still another map.
Transcripts. The other thing we were going to do is get forensic artists, composite artists, to do renditions of those encounters as well. Anyway, this is like the experimental, hardcore, quantitative. But it all depends on the kind of questions, you know, what you're trying to prove, right? If you're trying to prove it to scientists or to kind of like you know, people of a reductionist mindset, of course they want objective evidence. I don't think your indigenous shamans would really give a shit.
They might.
Sarah Spellman has had her hand up really patiently for ages, Dave. Sorry, I'm conscious.
Yeah, sure.
Sarah, have you got your hand up? Yeah. Sorry.
Trying to. Yeah, hi. Thank you. That was a really interesting talk. And yeah, I was glad to sit in. I'm not from Exeter, but I'm glad to sit in with you guys. So thank you for that. I was wondering, just going back briefly to the bit about, I know you mentioned a theoretical experiment that you might be able to do, looking at some of the more psychic phenomena around these experiences. I was wondering given that there can be entity encounters in these experiences, and we know that there are entity encounters, and as you mentioned, parallels sometimes with alien abduction experiences and other things that we kind of bracket as paranormal. In some of those experiences, if you look at the literature there from, you know, when people have interviewed people who have those experiences, there can be a theme there seems to be, it's not always, but there is a kind of a thing that can happen seemingly where people report that after that experience, they've they've had psychic sort of phenomena in their own life. They have maybe poltergeist phenomena in their home, or they will feel that they have psychic abilities to some extent, or so kind of changes along those lines that they maybe didn't predict or didn't seek. And so I'm just wondering if, and I assume this would be anecdotal, I assume this has not kind of been studied, but if you knew of any similar cases when people who kind of don't feel that they've had those experiences previously, then take psychedelics and then have those changes in their own lives.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I reviewed all the literature on that in my book, Other Worlds, and in a few separate papers, looking at kind of shifts in kind of paranormal experience and beliefs induced through psychedelics. And of course, yeah, there are, kind of big shifts in the pro-paranormal direction. People tend to have more psychic experiences. They tend to have a lot of psychic experiences during the psychic experiences during the psychedelic experience, but also as a result of that as well. Afterwards, they have a greater tendency to have more experiences later, and also to change their belief. And the belief and experience kind of go hand in hand as far as kind of paranormal stuff goes. And there is, of course, as you rightly point out, a big overlap there with how people respond to these kind of apparent alien abduction experiences. And you could think of it as a kind of like Venn diagram of like alien abduction experiences, psychedelic experiences, near-death experiences, and they all have these kind of overlap of features, and some of which are the after effects of, increased kind of empathy, reduced fear of death, increase of apparent psychic experiences. All those three things are common to those three kinds of experiences. And people like Raymond Moody, is it Moody? Or Kenneth Ring, actually did a kind of study on that, wrote a whole book called The Omega Project, I think, where he looked at the parallels between near-death experiences and alien abduction experiences, particularly in the kind of after effects that people have. So there is something about these kind of profound, let's call them exceptional or transpersonal or mystical like experiences that people may have, be they psychedelic near-death or alien abduction, which lead to these kind of very pronounced changes in a transpersonal direction, that people, once they've kind of been cracked open in that way, are more open to those kinds of experiences. Yeah,
it's interesting. Thank you.
Any other questions? Anyone? Oh, Rob, someone's got their hand up.
Oh,
Spirit is having.
Hey Dave, thanks for the talk. So I was wondering, is there like most of the papers are on the taxonomy of creatures or beings that people have seen. Has there been work done on, say, what the interactions are? So are people getting operated on by more than just the insectoids? Because a lot of the alpha counts, for example, are about interactions and people trying to communicate with them. Whereas a lot of the insectoid ones are obviously, like you say, about just sitting back and taking it, a lot like the DMT experience itself.
Yeah, that's a really nice question. I don't think it's obviously quite a big data set and it's messy, and it's like, I don't think anyone's really kind of drilled down into it, but there's a few papers now emerging and that data's there, so that can be looked into. It's a good question. My guess is that, you'd have to look at kind of passivity and in those experiences. I don't know classically people are being operated on by any old being, or if it's just insects, but maybe there's something inherently alien-esque or insectoid about being operated on, right? I don't know, that induces that kind of experience, but I couldn't give you a hard answer on that. But I could say that somebody could go away and look at that in a bit more detail. My guess is that I would say it's probably quite prevalent with the insectoids and less so with other kind of encounters. Yeah,
because as a professional contextualist that I am, I suppose, I've been looking at the kind of iconography of the religious iconography in kind of 60s LSD reports, and the devil obviously appears quite a lot. I would say, because of the kind of more Christian cultures there, but they're always wrestling with the devil. They're like, have real physical interactions of what they're describing going on. And I wonder as well whether that's to do with the substance. So obviously you're a bit more active when you can take LSD, or you feel you can be a bit more active, where DMT is obviously a bit more like stay where you are.
Yeah. I mean, it does kind of induce a kind of passivity, doesn't it? But it often, like, one of the things that is really interesting is people very rarely have accounts of their own body. Although it is slightly different with injected DMTs. People feel their body going, right, a bit more easily. Whereas with inhaled DMT, it's just like you had a body 1 second and then poof, it's gone. And so like that whole like lying down, standing up thing, it's kind of somewhat irrelevant, I think. People never really see their bodies. They often associate with the beings they're encountering. So like sometimes, quite often, people feel like they are like one of the beings they're seeing. Yeah, it's interesting. But there's always what I'm finding really interesting though is like this kind of how it books this whole idea of the mystical experience. You know, supposedly DMT experience is classically mystical, in it ticks all the boxes on the MEQ, and yet there's nothing about unity. It's all about self and other. You know, it's always like there is this other, there is yourself, and that is quite apparent, even though your own body image is kind of absent, and yet somehow still there. It's like you've not got a body, but you know, you're kind of aware that you had one. Maybe it's a weird one. But yeah, it deserves drilling down to some more as a professional contextualist.
Okay.
Well,
Adrian, you wanted to come in here?
Yeah, just a quick one. First of all, fantastic speech. It's a sort of specific question, but given that sort of the RNIB have advice for people suffering Charles Bonnet syndrome and seeing sort of little people in their living room with them, and this is almost considered, run of the mill for people with sort of visual issues. When it comes to ayahuasca, do you ever ask people about the sort of background? So if the entities are in the foreground, what's going on in the background? Is there commonality of the background and the sort of place where the entities are appearing? And is there any sort of hint that, you know, if there is something pareidoilic going on, it's very much down to the fact that it's in a weird setting or it's in a completely other place? Because of course the RNIB say, don't worry if you see little people in your living room when you've got Charles Bonnet syndrome, because it's just a thing going on inside your brain.
Yeah, really. I mean, and it really depends, you know, and it different for different substances, you know. So like in this case, like DMT and ayahuasca aren't necessarily directly comparable. With DMT, you know, you are like, this world kind of pretty much disappears and you are somewhere else, you know. Like in our DMT study, the people go and they're not really, they might even try and interact with you a little bit, but they are really not here, you know, in this kind of classic here state. And yet with ayahuasca, which tends to be a bit milder, you know, you can be fully aware of your room and surroundings, and then have come visionary experiences as well, but often more so with your eyes closed. But, you know, my own experience, for instance, you know, I've encountered like elves and DMT, which was quite astonishing. They were kind of doing things to me. And but then I had an experience on ayahuasca where I had my eyes open, and a couple of like little people kind of just trotted in through the door of the tent of the particular dwelling we were in front of me and the people, you know. So like it was just like everything looked like a room, you know, with people in it, and then a couple of little pixies kind of just trotted in front of me, which was kind of really even more disturbing somehow, because, you know, it's one thing seeing these things with your eyes closed or in a kind of completely disembodied state, but then when they seem to just appear in the room like you had Charles Bonnet syndrome, then, you know, that's a little bit more worrying when you haven't got a neurologist to tell you, oh no, it's fine, they're meant to be there. So yeah, it depends. It really depends.
So it's pure DMT people. It's a bit more like the sort of scene from The Matrix. It's just people in the middle of a sort of wash of a color and encountering. So just interested in what's going on at the periphery of these experiences, not just because people get very focused on the entity in front of them, like they do with a sort of knife and a gun in certain experiences. But
yeah, well, they're hard to pin down because it's often like sentient geometry, and that's usually how it starts. So it's usually kind of like intense geometry, and then geometry starts to come alive, and has this sentience and takes out form. And even when it's like hyper real, it's often very difficult to pin down the beings anyway. It's like if you focus on them and try and like, what are they made of, what is it, and they're self-transforming, as Terence McKenna said. They don't keep still long enough for you to really grok what they are. And Lewis Eduardo Luna put it really nicely in our latest book, in that it's like what they actually are isn't really kind of worked out until you come back and you give it a name. You apply language to it. And it's the closest thing you can give to naming it, to identifying it. But at the time, it's just like this thing, which is kind of usually defies description or naming. And then you come back and you give it the closest thing you can find to an identity for it. But they don't usually keep still long enough for you to kind of fully apprehend what they seem to be, I would say.
Brilliant. Thank you.
In my humble experience.
Should we finish, or do you want to keep going? You're probably really... I've got questions, but I can just ask you another time, because I realise we're at time and you've got COVID, and it's been amazing.
I don't mind. You can go through if you want, Celia.
I want to continue. I've got to go to another talk quickly downstairs.
Okay, no problem then.
So one of mine was, just very, very quickly, and it's probably quite mundane, actually, is about after the DMT experience. Do you capture that in your work, and whether people, because some of these things sound quite terrifying, I guess, like a lot of psychedelic experiences, but you've really captured the phenomenology. Is there anything about the phenomenology that's predictive of how you feel afterwards? Like whether I guess typically do people experience enhanced well-being, but do people get more dissociative experiences? I mean, just being operated on by a praying mantis sounds tough thing to integrate, basically. Yeah. You got any sense of that from your work?
I don't have any good data on that. In and of itself, it isn't necessarily a bad experience, It's
speak from experience as well.
It's disturbing, but often people come back from it and they're just a bit like, I'm not really sure, I'm just really not sure about that. People don't necessarily have like a terrifying experience during that. They may, maybe just kind of, they may themselves feel a bit neutral about it, So I don't think it's just like, this is kind of not like systematized answer, right, based on any data. Just that I think it really depends. You can have experiences which seemingly are quite banal and be really disturbing. Whereas what seemed to be on the surface of it a terrifying experience can actually be quite benign. So I don't think it necessarily follows, but it probably does deserve like looking into in a bit more depth. If I was a bit more clinically inclined, I should probably do that sooner as well.
No, you keep doing your stuff as much. Anyone else got any questions? Oh, well, thanks ever so much.
Thanks for having me. It's great.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant.
Nice to see you all.
Absolutely fantastic. Thanks.
Thank you, David.
Right.
Yeah, toodle pip. I can't wait for the next one.
Yeah. And if anyone wants to come downstairs to the talk about environmental stuff, bye everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye, thanks ever so much. Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.